people get stuck in their niche and they don't move.
Okay.
So, yeah, this is, you wonder sometimes, well, how can companies die so quickly? Well, they go into a death spiral that's almost impossible for them to get out of. So, anyway, so the take-home lesson from this is 0. Right, right. And then that's like a graph of monetary distribution as well. And the problem with being at 0 is it's very difficult to get out of 0. This is also why people get stuck in poverty, you know. You can't get a bank account if you don't have any money, right? There's a bunch of things that start to move against you when you're at 0 that you can't shake. It's very difficult to get out of the pit here, because 0 is a kind of pit. Okay, so now we've got the Creative Achievement Questionnaire, and we're going to take your score, and your score is summed across all the categories and all the exemplars of the categories that you've chosen. So then the question is, well, can you predict creative achievement? And this is how we did it. This was construct validation. The first thing we wanted to know was, well, was the Creative Achievement Questionnaire actually associated with something that you might regard as creativity? Okay, so we got a number of students to come in, and we gave them a collage kit. And so then everybody got exactly the same kit. And then we had to make a collage out of the collage kit. And then we have 5 artists rate the collage for quality. And then we averaged across the ratings. Now the first thing you would do if you did that is, because you might think, well, can artists actually come up with a measure of how creative a collage is? And the answer to that is actually technical. If all, say you guys are the panel, if all of you identify the same collages as of high quality and the same ones as of low quality, then we can assume that there's something about your judgment that's like independent of your idiosyncrasies. We could say, well, there is a judgment that emerges as a consensus across artists. And the first thing we found was that there was quite a high correlation between each artist's judgment of the quality of the collages. I can't remember what the inter-rater reliability was, but it was something like 0.8. It was really high. So it was clear that trained artists could make reliable judgments about the quality of collages, because you had to check that out first. Because if they're all over the place, you got no measure, right? It's like everyone's using a different ruler. You've got no measure. So they have to be using the same ruler. Well, we found that the correlation between the creative evaluation of collages and the total CAQ was 0.59, which is mind-boggling. I told you last time that under 5% of published social science studies demonstrate a correlation coefficient of an effect size greater than 0.5. This is 0.6. And if you square it, 0.5 squared is 25% of the variance, 0.6 squared is 36% of the variance. 0.6 is a lot more than 0.5. And 0.5 is unheard of. So the fact that you could estimate someone's lifetime creative achievement by having them do a collage that 4 artists rate is an indication that there really is something real at the bottom of it, right? Because that's like the definition of real. The creative personality scale, you circle adjectives that are associated with creativity from a very large list of adjectives. That worked pretty well. Goldberg's adjective markers, that's another big 5 variant. That was correlated at about 0.51. It doesn't measure openness to experience, it just measures intellect. But be that as it may, it's still a personality marker of trait openness. It was correlated at 0.51. The NEO-PIR openness was correlated at 0.33, and then we used the divergent thinking tests, and I told you about those already. It's how many uses can you think of for a brick, for example. And so those are scored according to fluency, how many answers you provide, and then also originality, how many unique, useful answers do you provide, and that was nicely correlated as well. Overall, correlation of 0.47, and then fluency 0.38, originality 0.46, and flexibility 0.37. So what does that mean? Well, the Creative Achievement Questionnaire indexes lifetime creative achievement in a way that's powerfully associated with actual creative production of a single item, plus creativity as it's indexed by personality markers. The CAQ is also potently predicted by IQ, which is exactly what we expect. So you can do an extraordinarily good job of determining how likely someone is to have high levels of creative achievement across their lifespan by using certain tests. So it means that creativity is a real thing. That's the first thing, both in terms of thinking creatively, and that would be the divergent thinking tests, and also in terms of creative production, and that creative production and creative thinking are quite tightly aligned. So that was good. That's been a very influential paper. I think it's got about 500 citations now. People use the Creative Achievement Questionnaire a lot to assess creativity. It's also associated with a higher than average likelihood of psychosis. And the other thing you see with creative people is that they tend, especially if they're writers, they tend, the pathology that goes along with that is often manic depressive disorder. And that's partly because manic people become unbelievably fluent. Right? They speak incredibly quickly. They generate ideas like mad. And it's a hyper arousal of the positive emotion system, roughly speaking. And that can have, as a side effect, creativity. So this is a cool study. I just found this one today. It's a terror management study. So well, I'll read it to you. The relationship between creativity and symbolic immortality had been long acknowledged by scholars. In a review of the literature, we found 12 papers that empirically examined the relationship between creativity and mortality awareness using a terror management theory paradigm, overall supporting the notion that creativity plays an important role in the management of existential concerns. Also, a mini meta-analysis of the impact of death awareness on creativity resulted in a small medium-weighted mean effect. We examined the existential buffering functions of creative achievement as assessed by the Creative Achievement Questionnaire in a sample of 108 students. At high but not low levels of creative goals, creative achievement was associated with lower death thought accessibility under mortality salience. Well, that means if you remind people that they're going to die, creative people were less likely to generate death-related thoughts as a consequence. To our knowledge, this is the first empirical report of the anxiety buffering functions of creative achievement among people for whom creativity constitutes a central part of their cultural worldview. It's like an empirical examination of some of the existential theories that I was presenting to you previously, because part of the idea that was put forth, say, by people like Nietzsche was that one of the ways to fight back against existential anxiety and death anxiety and all of that is to engage in creative production. And so that was actually put to the empirical test in this study. So I thought that was quite cool. So here's another paper. This was by Kaufman and a couple of my students, Jacob Hirsch and Colin DeYoung. I'm on that paper as well near the end there. They were interested in whether openness and intellect predicted different elements of creative achievement. So it goes back to your question about differentiation between the artsy end of creativity and the practical the practical end associated, for example, with proclivity towards nonfiction. The big five personality dimension, openness/intellect, is the trait most closely associated with creativity and creative achievement. Little is known, however, regarding the discriminant validity of its two aspects. Discriminant validity is whether one aspect predicts one set of things and the other aspect predicts a different set of things. If there's no discriminant validity, if they can't be used for different purposes, then there's no point having them. So you want to see that they're actually capable of differentiating between real-world phenomena. Two of its aspects, openness to experience, reflecting cognitive engagement with perception, fantasy, aesthetics, and emotions, and intellect, reflecting cognitive engagement with abstract and semantic information, primarily through reasoning. In relation to creativity, in 4 demographically diverse samples totaling over 1,000 participants, we investigated the independent predictive validity of openness and intellect by assessing the relations among cognitive ability, divergent thinking, personality, and creative achievement across the arts and sciences. We confirmed the hypothesis that openness predicts creative achievement in the arts, and intellect predicts creative achievement in the sciences. Inclusion of performance measures of general cognitive ability, that's IQ, and divergent thinking indicated that the relationship of intellect to scientific creativity may be due at least in part to these abilities. Lastly, we found that traditionally predicted creative achievement in the arts independently of openness. So what that means is that creative achievement in the arts is actually a function of the higher order trait plasticity, right? Because plasticity is openness plus extroversion, and that's associated fundamentally with activation of the underlying dopaminergic system, which is the system that mediates exploratory behavior. So if you're dominated by that function of that system, you're an exploratory, gregarious person, then you're more likely to manifest creative ability in the arts. So apparently, it's time to stop. I think that's the same student who always does that, isn't it? All right, we'll see you on Tuesday. So we're going to discuss some very rough things today. Maybe you're somewhat accustomed to that already, but this is particularly brutal, I think. I'm going to talk to you about a body of research that's been produced over about the last 10 years, and I think it's a body of research that might outline some of the most important things that psychologists have ever discovered. It's really changed my view, for example, on what happened in Nazi Germany, which we're going to talk about a lot today. And, you know, we've already talked a fair bit about the temperamental determinants of political belief, right? And I've made a case for you that people who are liberal or lean to the left tend to be high in trait openness and low in trait conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and people on the right tend to be low in openness and high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness. And the effect is not trivial. If you look at just voting behavior, then you get the typical sort of effect sizes that are characteristic of personality research, 0.2 to 0.4, something like that, correlations. But if you start to analyze people's political beliefs in detail, so you get your measurement up to the point where it's nice and reliable and nice and valid, then temperament accounts for a substantially higher proportion of the variance. And so a lot of what people seem to do is, one thing you could think of is that they politicize their temperament by constructing post hoc arguments about the way the world is. But it's deeper than that, you see, because we already know that you have to use filtering mechanisms in order to orient yourself in the world, right? Because the world is just too complicated for you to orient yourself without using filtering mechanisms. And the question is, well, what are the filtering mechanisms? And to a large degree, they're your temperamental proclivities, because they set up your value structure, for example, and that sets up your perceptual frame. And so what that means is that you screen the world at the level of the facts that display themselves to you. Because, you know, you could say, well, you're a dispassionate observer of the universe of facts, and that you extract out the conclusions that a reasonable person would extract out from that body of facts. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because your perceptions are biased by your temperament. And they have to be because you have to screen things. And so you screen things in accordance with your temperament. You know, you're oriented towards certain things in the world, certain values, for example. And that's perfectly reasonable, because you can't do everything at once anyways. So there's no reason for you not to be directional. The question is, what are the pathologies associated with directionality? Now, conscientiousness is a very interesting trait in relationship to that, because there are obvious benefits to being conscientious, right? I mean, it's the best long-term predictor of job performance, for example, and I'll outline some other data. That might be more associated with industriousness than orderliness, but there's utility to orderliness as well, and we'll cover that in detail today. The question is, no, the issue is that you never get a benefit without a price. And so you can see that with agreeableness. If you're agreeable, high in agreeableness, then you're compassionate and polite, and you're empathic, and you can work well in teams. But the price you pay for that is that you don't negotiate very well on your own behalf, and that you can be easily taken advantage of. And then if you're very low in agreeableness, well, then you're more competitive and more out to win, I would say. But the price you pay for that is that if you become too disagreeable, then you're likely to be sufficiently antisocial, let's say, so that you might end up in prison. So, and he was supported by his aged mother, and it was just a catastrophe. And he'd go outside and try to walk the puppy, and the puppy would just sit down, right? Because it was doing dominant stuff, and he didn't know how to overcome it. And then these crazy people from across the way who styled themselves as animal rights activists started to harass him, And they phoned up his mother and told him that if she didn't take the dog away from that retard, they were going to come over and, you know, do terrible things to him. And then he got harassed on the street, and then he went to a park with his dog, and they came up to him and pushed him on the car and swiped his dog and ran off to the to the SPCA and dumped it there, and he had to move away from his apartment, and God, it was just an absolute catastrophe. They had plenty of sympathy for that damn dog, but no sympathy whatsoever for the guy, you know. It was really something. Anyways, the story ended happily, weirdly enough. He got a job with a woman who used to be a psychiatric nurse who was training dogs, and she gave him a little job setting up the dog training thing, and then he got to learn to train his dog. He lost, like, he was a thin guy to begin with. He lost like 30 pounds trying to learn how to take care of this puppy. It was just, I thought he was gonna die, but there was no way he was gonna give up that dog. And so anyways, OCD, it's quite the bloody catastrophe. So, and it's a good thing for someone who has OCD to have a dog, right? Because dogs are messy, and so there's all sorts of things that are messy about them, but you have to kind of live with the mess, like you have to live with the mess if you're going to have a child or if you're going to have a partner of any sort. You know, you can't let the orderliness part of you get the upper hand so terribly that it's impossible for you to live. That's what happens to girls who have anorexia, by the way. You know how there's this idea with regards to anorexia that it's often high-achieving girls who have it. Well, it's hyper-conscientious girls. They get so disgust-sensitive they can't stand their own bodies. And so, for example, then they stop being able to look at their bodies properly, and so what they do, instead of looking at their whole body, they lose the ability to do that. They only can see parts of their body, and then they can't tell the difference between a part that's healthy and well-shaped and a fat part. And so anything that's what would you call, of dubious, anything that's hard to measure becomes impossible to see. So I had an anorexic client at one point. She wasn't a very big woman, maybe about this big and thin, yes, obviously. And so I was trying to work with her on her body perception disorder, and one of the things I did was, so I had her come and sit beside me. So I was sitting like this, and so was she, and I said, well, you look at our two thighs, which one is bigger? And like mine was like 40% bigger. And she said, well, I can't tell, they look the same to me. And so I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. I let her do it. I said, you take a pencil, and I'll sit on a piece of paper, and you just trace my thigh, okay, and then you can put that piece of paper underneath your thigh and trace it, and then you can look at the difference. So I had her do that, and she looked at the two pieces of paper, and she couldn't believe it. Could not believe that was actually the case, that her perception had become so disordered that it was impossible for her to see the real shape of her body. And we would go outside, and I would ask her, you know, is that person thin, is that person fat? And with other people she could tell, but with her own body, not a chance. She couldn't see it properly at all. And so there's a real obsession with purity among women who have anorexia. You know, they'd like to starve themselves right down to the bone, because the bone is sort of pure and white, and there's no excess tissue on it. And so anorexia also looks like a disease of disgust. And so it's very, very difficult to, she thought very black and white terms. One of the things I had her do at one point was, she said, I either really like a song or I don't like it at all. And I said, okay, well, you've got a music collection. Why don't you go through like 20 of those songs and rate them on a scale from 1 to 10? And she couldn't do it. It was either yes or no, orderly, right? The boundaries around the categories were absolutely segregated. And her apartment tended to be decorated in black and white. And she was hyper clean, you know, so everything in the apartment was extraordinarily orderly, well put away. She couldn't stand to see anything disgusting on the counters and that sort of thing. So very, very difficult disorder to treat, anorexia. Very, very difficult. So, and you know, you can see how it can go wrong, because food, you know, when you're eating, your disgust systems are on alert, you know, like you want the thing you want to eat, and you absolutely don't want the thing you don't want to eat, and your mouth is very sensitive to that sort of thing, you know, to the texture and all of that, and your sense of smell is very sensitive to that sort of thing, because, you know, you don't want to eat anything that's contaminated or poisonous. So it's another situation like sex, where the reward system is driving you forward to engage in a consumatory behavior, but the disgust system is right there modulating and moderating it, and there's a tension between those two things that's always at work. And with the anorexic types, the disgust system gets the upper hand. So she was also extraordinarily judgmental and perfectionistic, but that goes along with it, because orderly people are judgmental and perfectionistic. And so if you're a perfectionist, often what that means is you have very high levels of orderliness and very high levels of neuroticism. And those two things chase each other around like mad, because you can't stand the idea that you would make a mistake, and you get anxious about it as well. So then you get stuck in this perfectionistic mindset, and you can't get out of it. So Inducing disgust responses, whether via a foul order, a disgusting work environment, or recalling a disgusting experience, led individuals to assign harsher punishments to others who had committed moral transgressions. So you describe a moral transgression, you could be breaking a law, you expose the people in the experiment to some disgusting stimulus, and then you ask them about the probability that the person was guilty, and then also how long they should be imprisoned or how much they should be fined. And if you get the people disgusted, then the probability, especially if they're orderly, then the probability of assigning a harsh punishment goes upward. So if you're ever in court, don't disgust the judge, right? That's part of the deal. Harsher moral judgments can even be induced following the consumption of a bitter drink, because bitter substances are often poison, or poisonous substances are often bitter, and that induces a disgust response as well. Although you can overcome that. Coffee is bitter, olives are bitter, so you can retrain your system to accept those things as food, but it's not very easy. In addition, the same disgust-related facial expressions are observed in response to unpleasant tastes, disgusting photographs, and receiving unfair treatment in an economic gain. Concerns about cleanliness, and interesting. So some of you may know I was at McMaster University a couple of weeks ago, and there were a bunch of protesters there, and I went up to meet the protesters because I kind of wanted to see what would happen. There were a bunch of them around the back of the room. I offered to shake their hands, and mostly what I got was disgust faces, and that's not good. That's not good. So here's something to know too. Here's a good predictor of whether or not you're going to get divorced. You go into the therapist's office and you talk, the two of you talk, and you roll your eyes. That'll predict. If you're rolling your eyes at your partner, you're going to divorce them. Why? It's a disgust response, right? It's something like, I'm lifting you up with my eyes and throwing you into the garbage. It's something like that. But eye rolling is a great predictor of the probability of divorce. So it's something to keep in mind with regards to your relationships. Like if you're starting to develop some contempt or some disgust, you bloody well better get on that right away, because that's a bad road to go down. And so then you have to do whatever you have to do not to go down that road. Yeah, so, see, one of the things I think that's happening on the political landscape, and like we know, for example, that the more authoritarian politically correct types are high in agreeableness and high in orderliness, so that's a very interesting combination. And I think what's happening is that they're very rapidly dividing the world into contemptible predator. Like snakes often elicit a disgust response, right? A predator will elicit a disgust response, like a crocodile or an alligator or a snake or something like that. And so it's the predator response that's being evoked to the people who are on the other side of the political spectrum, roughly speaking. And so they're categorized as like contemptible predators, something like that. And the people that are being protected are like innocent victims. That's how it appears. And that's a very, very dangerous thing to have happen, as I'll show you. Concerns about cleanliness and feelings of disgust have likewise been related to political attitudes. Situational reminders of the importance of physical cleanliness, such as asking participants to wipe their hands with antiseptic wipes, tend to increase self-reported political conservatism. Such as finding is consistent with the notion that purity tends to be valued more highly by conservatives than by liberals. Individuals who report being disgusted more easily also tend to hold more conservative political views on topics including abortion, gay marriage, tax cuts, and affirmative action. In addition to the effects that have emerged when using self-reported disgust sensitivity, more conservative political views have also been associated with stronger physiological reactivity to disgusting images. There's a lawyer, Martha Nussbaum, who's also a political philosopher, who says that we should eliminate the effect of disgust on our political theorizing, that disgust shouldn't be something that's considered as a valid means of information from which you might derive political conclusions. So if I find your behavior disgusting, or if you find my behavior disgusting, according to Nussbaum, that should be independent. You should try to make that rationally independent of your political views. I'd like to believe that, but there's a problem, and this is the problem that we're going to go through. You can't muck about with these underlying systems. You can't just say, ignore the reports of your disgust system, because it isn't like your emotions are insane and irrational and you have the rationality on top of that that's guiding you properly. That isn't how it works. All of these underlying biological systems guide you, and to the degree that the degree to which you're guided properly is a consequence of the balance of the action of these underlying biological systems, but the balance is very complexly maintained. You need a disgust system, because if you didn't, you'd eat something that would kill you, and then you would die. Or you'd do something stupid, and you'd end up like you'd get cut, and it would be dirty, and you wouldn't clean it, and then you would die. So the idea that you can somehow just rationalize the output of the disgust system and decontaminate your political viewpoints as a consequence seems to me to be very, very naive. Not that there's no danger to it, because there's plenty of danger to it. In addition, a large literature has converged on the notion that there are two core dimensions of conservative political ideology: resistance to change and tolerance of inequality. Resistance to change reflects the extent to which people wish to maintain the status quo, while tolerance of inequality reflects the acceptance of an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities within society. Jost has done a lot of that work. Jost's supervisor is Mazen Banaji, and Mazen Banaji is a known Marxist. And so this is another place where political ideology contaminates, as far as I'm concerned, scientific inquiry, because Jost's work on let's say resistance to change is predicated on the idea that the conservative inclination to support the maintenance of already existing structures is precisely equivalent to supporting an unjust system. And that's not a reasonable thing to do if you're looking at these sorts of things from a scientific perspective. You don't get to make judgments like that, but they're built into the questionnaires. So, resistance to change reflects the extent to which people wish to maintain the status quo, while tolerance of inequality reflects the acceptance of an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities within society. These two dimensions appear roughly aligned with social and economic conservatism as expressed in the constructs of right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, respectively. There is no left-wing authoritarian psychological scales. We're trying to derive one right now. But the reason for that is that after World War II, the social science community was responding to what had happened in Nazi Germany, and perfectly appropriately, and they examined right-wing authoritarianism as a consequence, but they never examined left-wing authoritarianism because the prevailing, what would you call it, political landscape of the time made the idea that there could be left-wing authoritarianism sufficiently incorrect politically so that it was never analyzed from the perspective of social science, even though the evidence for left-wing authoritarianism, say by the end of the 1940s, was absolutely overwhelming, right? By the 1930s, people were reporting on what had happened in the Soviet Union, you know, the forced dekulakization, for example, of the agricultural industry in the Soviet Union, and the consequent deaths of several million people in the Ukraine. It was all extraordinarily well documented. These core facets of conservatism are also closely related to the two higher order value dimensions described in moral foundations theory, which reflect preferences for order and tradition on the one hand, and preferences for egalitarianism on the other. Importantly, the motivational basis of these two dimensions appears to vary independently from one another, with an individual's overall political attitudes on a left-right spectrum emerging from their relative balance. These motives are also strongly rooted in basic personality characteristics, such that preferences for order and tradition are associated with higher levels of orderliness. Now you might think that's obvious, right? Well, obviously orderliness is associated with preference for order. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you can measure it, right? That's the issue. So these things seem self-evident, but it's taken a very long time to build up the instruments that allow them to be measured in such a way that you can also start to look at the correlates and the underlying psychophysiology. So it's by no means obvious. Higher levels of orderliness, an aspect of conscientiousness, and politeness, an aspect of agreeableness, as well as lower levels of openness and intellect. In contrast, preferences for egalitarianism are uniquely associated with compassion, an aspect of agreeableness. So, and that's exactly what we found when we were looking at political correctness, which is primarily predicted not by openness or by conscientiousness, but by agreeableness. Political conservatism can therefore be thought of as a social immune system, reflecting the extension of pathogen avoidance mechanisms to the integrity of the social system. borders, boundaries, right? That's the orderly person. We'll keep borders between concepts. We'll keep borders between people. We'll keep borders between towns. We'll keep borders between political ideas and religions and states. Why? Because we don't want the terrible things flooding in from everywhere. Now, the liberal will say, wait a minute, all the things flooding in from everywhere aren't terrible. They have great utility, and that's true. But the problem is, they're both true. They're both true at the same time because, well, and we'll document that as we move forward. So then the question is, well, how do you know when things should be more open and when things should be more closed? And the answer to that is, well, you better have a chat with everyone and find out what they think, because it's a balance of probabilities. There's no way of determining it a priori. It's a balance of probabilities. And so you have to have a discussion to determine how wide the gates should be open and how narrow they should be closed. And that's also going to depend on the circumstances and the situation. So there's no way of, this is the thing that's so terrible about this. There's no way of determining a priori whose position is correct. Just as the behavioral, yes, in particular the social immune system would help to maintain order by suppressing any actions or individuals that deviate from a group's accepted social traditions. It has been reported, for example, that regions with higher levels of disease prevalence tend to be associated with higher levels of social conformity and autocratic rule. Individuals who feel more vulnerable to disease likewise report higher levels of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Such basic concerns about pathogen avoidance may thus contribute to the desire for order and tradition among conservatives, along with the harsh moral judgments associated with violations of the social order. How do you purify something? How about with fire? That's something to keep in mind as we move towards the more political expressions of this. And the thing about something that's disgusting is you don't isolate it. Exactly. You destroy it, right? It's the thing you do with rats and insects, for example, is destroy them, right? And you do that with poison, you do it with fire, you do it by cleaning things up. And you do that because, well, the rats will eat all your crops and the insects carry disease and all of that. So, or they infest your food, which I don't know what proportion of today's food production is eaten by rats and insects, but it's a huge proportion still. According to the parasite stress hypothesis, authoritarian governments are more likely to emerge in regions characterized by a high prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. Now, who the hell would have ever guessed that? Hey, this is where you see the real utility of a genuine social science, because it's by no means self-evident, this hypothesis. And this paper that I'm going to discuss with you right now just blew me away when I read it. I thought it should have been front page news across the world, but didn't really attract that much attention. Recent cross-national evidence is consistent with this hypothesis, but there are differential limitations associated with that evidence. We report 2 studies that address some of the limitations and provide further tests of the hypothesis. Study 1 revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. So that's very interesting. So the more parasitic and transmissible diseases in a particular locale, the higher the probability that people, when measured at the individual level, held authoritarian attitudes. Because you might say, well, there's parasite prevalence, that produces a repressive government, but it doesn't really affect people at the level of personality, and that's not what was found in the studies. It was reversed. The parasite prevalence / infectious diseases made people more authoritarian, and that was what was driving the more authoritarian government. So here's something cool. Who knows about this, right? So how do you fight authoritarian governments across the world? You get rid of infectious disease. That could be it. That could be the key. So, and then again, that is by no means a self-evident hypothesis. Study 1 that revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. And this effect statistically mediated the relationship between parasite prevalence and authoritarian governance. Parasites, personality, authoritarian state. That's the causal pathway. This mediation result is inconsistent with alternative explanations for previous findings. To address further limitations associated with cross-national comparisons, Study 2 tested the parasite stress hypothesis on a sample of traditional small-scale societies. Results revealed that parasite prevalence predicted measures of authoritarian governance and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare. One additional threat, famine, also uniquely predicted authoritarianism. Together, these results further substantiate the parasite stress hypothesis of authoritarianism and suggest that societal differences in authoritarian governance result in part from cultural differences in individuals' authoritarian personalities. Here's the effect sizes. So look, they're mind-boggling. So first, that's authoritarian governance. 1, pathogen prevalence. The correlation is 0.42. 0.42, right? There's malnutrition. There's warfare. It's actually negatively correlated with warfare. Famine, 0.26. So if you square that, that's about 8% of the variance. That's about 16% of the variance. So those are walloping effect sizes, right? That effect size is about, so that's 16%. The typical effect size for a personality variable is about 0.2 to 0.3, so let's say 0.25, so that's about 7% of the variance. That's 16 to 17% of the variance. You almost never see a correlation of that size. So it's an absolutely remarkable piece of work. And it has all sorts of terrifying implications. So the question is now, why would you have such a powerful immune system, behavioral immune system, disgust system? Okay, so let's look at some little known facts about the history of North America. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but it's worth knowing. Okay, so what was the pre-Columbian population of the Americas? The answer is, we don't really have any idea. The estimates vary from 10 million to 100 million, with an emerging consensus of 50 million. Well, it's halfway. Okay, we don't know. We could be out by 1 order of magnitude, but a fair number of people. So what happened to all the Native Americans? Well, that's easy. They all died. Why? Because when the Spaniards came, see, there was no diseases in the New World, except for maybe syphilis. There's some evidence that syphilis was transmitted back to Europe as a consequence of contact with North and South America. But there were almost no diseases in the Americas. And that's partly because there were no big cities, and also because even where there were, not compared to Europe, and also because where there were big cities in Europe, people lived close with animals, and there was lots of movement of disease pathogens back and forth between the animals and the human beings. And so lots of Europeans died as a consequence of that, like huge numbers of them, especially from diseases, say, like smallpox or measles. But the Europeans built up a whopping immunity to all these diseases, including influenza, and then they came to the Americas with their diseases, and bang, it killed all the Native Americans. It figured 90% of them. So here's some of the statistics. What were the diseases that wiped them out? Influenza, bubonic plague, smallpox, measles, even chickenpox was deadly to the Native Americans. So from 1492 to 1650, there was a death toll of 90%. So you know, when the Puritans landed in the US at Plymouth Rock, that was a long time after the Spaniards had landed in the more southern areas. The Indians, the Native Americans there, they were desperate to see them because they didn't have enough people to take off their crops. They didn't have enough people left. Imagine 9 out of 10 people died. That's everyone, right? You're done at that point. So there were 25 to 30 million people in Mexico before the arrival of Cortez. 50 years later, there were 3 million. So, and the Aboriginal population in Canada, estimates, this is accepted by the Canadian government, no one really knows, and the estimates do vary substantially. There might have been 500,000 people in Canada in 1450, and that decreased by 80% after contact with the Europeans. There's the population collapse in Mexico. 16th century population collapse in Mexico. So the 1545 and 1576 epidemics appear to have been hemorrhagic fevers caused by an indigenous viral agent and aggravated by unusual climatic conditions. The Mexican population did not recover to pre-Hispanic levels until the 20th century. Absolutely catastrophic consequences. So then you look at that and you think, well, is it really all that surprising that people have evolved extraordinarily powerful immune systems, disgust responses, and behavioral immune systems? I mean, this is no joke. It's absolutely catastrophic. So now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Hitler. So when I was sorting some of this stuff out, trying to look at this disgust sensitivity literature, and then understanding finally that it was associated with orderliness, and that orderliness was associated with conservatism, I was also reading a book by Adolf Hitler, which was called Hitler's Table Talk. It's a very interesting book, and Hitler had secretaries at his dinner tables from 1939 to 1942, and they basically took shorthand notes of what he said spontaneously. And so there's a book that you can buy called Hitler's Table Talk that that is nothing but a presentation of his spontaneous utterances across that time period. Now, Hitler was a very strange person. He was very high in openness, surprisingly enough, but also extremely high in orderliness. At least that's what you can infer from reading the historical data. So he bathed 4 times a day, for example. He was also a great admirer of willpower, which is something that's also associated with conscientiousness and orderliness. So he was very proud of his ability to stand like this for 8 hours in the back of a car, and his ability to withstand, you know, what would you call them, trying circumstances by willpower alone. One of the most famous film documentaries that was made in the Nazi era was called Triumph of the Will, right? Triumph of Willpower. That was by Leni Riefenstahl. I'm not saying that quite right. You can look at that on YouTube. It's a very interesting film. Horrifying film, but a very interesting one. Well, if you're wondering about orderliness, I mean, take a look at that, man. So that's Nuremberg, right? That was the biggest rally grounds ever made in human history, Nuremberg. And Hitler was unbelievably good at spectacle. Look at how absolutely perfectly ordered that is. God only knows how many people there. Several 100,000, because they could all fit on the parade ground at the same time. All in absolutely perfect formation. Orderliness. Gone out of control. It's interesting because people think about Nazism as a descent into barbarity, right? But what it looks like is a disease of civilization. That's a whole different thing, because conscientiousness predicts success in complex industrial societies. And this is actually conscientiousness gone out of control on the orderly end of things. And why? Well, the World War I, that was plenty chaotic. And there was a huge famine after World War I, right? In Spanish influenza killed more people than the war did. And it actually mutated in the trenches, because if people are packed close together, then viruses or other pathogens can be very deadly, because you don't have to live very long to give it to her. If people are dispersed, then the virus or the bacteria can't afford to kill you as fast, because then it dies too. And so if you pack people together, then you can breed unbelievably virulent forms of pathogens, infectious pathogens, and that's what happened in World War I. Packed all the men together in unsanitary conditions, poof, up came Spanish influenza, went all around the world after World War I and killed more people than the war. So, and after the war, after World War I, of course, Germany descended into utter chaos. So what happens when you descend into chaos? And the answer is there's a corresponding call for order. And that was answered by Hitler and the National Socialists. And Hitler was very good at listening to the German population, and what they were demanding in a period of chaos was order. And so that was exactly what he decided to provide. Spectacles of order, which is exactly what you'd expect from someone who is really high in openness and high in orderliness, right? Spectacles of order. And Hitler was also extremely interested in art, but he categorized art into like proper hygienic art and improper chaotic art, and he often would have art exhibits at the same time of the approved art that he approved of. So those were in the official museums, let's say, and then there would be a corresponding exhibit of degenerate art. And that was art that was associated with movements like Expressionism, for example, which has garish colors and it's very emotionally expressive. Hitler sort of preferred kind of eroticized Greco-Roman representations of heroic people. You know, that was the Nazi aesthetic, essentially. So there's some more examples of order, right? Look at that. Everything regular, order, well defined. Everything here is squares. Everyone's lined up perfectly. Everything is uniform, right? Look, there's pathways between the rows of people. This is again at Nuremberg. Perfect order. Along with his plans for the world capital of Romania, Albert Speer, that was the Nazi architect, made the plans for the world's largest stadium, which was to be located on the Nuremberg rally ground, derived from the Panathinaikos Stadium of Athens, which would have offered 400,000 seats. It was complete the shape of a horseshoe, planned dimensions, 800 meters wide, 450 meters high, 100 meters, with a building area of 350,000 square meters. The laying of the foundation stone was on 9th July 1937. It was to be finished for the Party Congress in 1945. In 38, the construction began with the excavation and stopped in 39, but during the whole war, the castings had been kept dry through groundwater. After the war, the northern half of the pit filled up with water, and is today called Silver Lake. The southern half was used to deposit the debris of the destroyed downtown Nuremberg. That's Nuremberg, Illinois. So what Hitler did, because he was very good at using fire and light in his display as well. So that curtain there, so you see there's the Nuremberg buildings that we saw in the last photograph. Those are the searchlights from the Nazi Air Force. So they had them arrayed all the way around the grounds there and pointed straight up, so that the nighttime rallies were illuminated by a cube of light. Very effective artistic display of orderliness. Now, here's where things get seriously ugly. So this is a pamphlet from, I think, 1944, and the pamphlet is called Jew as World Parasite. So this is something I found on the net. I'll share it with you. Very rare original late 1944 anti-Jewish Third Reich pamphlet. This very scarce 6 by 8 3/4 20-page softcover booklet by M.L. Reifer and Erich Schwartzberg was published 1944 in Frankfurt. It was published at a time when a great percentage of the European Jews had already been deported to concentration camps in the East, perhaps to justify what had happened to the Jews since the Nazi seizure of power. The authors compare the Jews with parasites, the most unpleasant forms of life on earth, and that it is only natural and justified against them to free humanity from the sake of survival of mankind. This is from the pamphlet. The people of the world will recognize the Jew as world parasite. There will be a time when there will be one united front of all people against the Jew as world parasite. The pamphlet ends, and humanity will be freed from the most severe illness from which it suffered from thousands of years. Here's what happened in Nazi Germany. So when Hitler came to power, he was very interested in public health campaigns, and so he formulated a number of policies, including formulating these vans that went around and screened people for tuberculosis. At the same time, he announced a policy to beautify and purify Germany. And so he encouraged the factory owners to clean up the factories, to get rid of the rats and the insects, and plant flowers and so forth in front, right? So it was cleanliness and beauty. They used Zyklon B as the agent for disinfecting the factories. Zyklon B was the gas that was used in the gas chambers. So Hitler started out by getting rid of the rats and the parasites and the insects in Germany, along with his public health campaign. Then he moved into the insane asylums and started the euthanasia campaign, and then he moved outside into the broader political sphere and started to target the people that he didn't consider pure as parasites, capitalizing on the behavioral immune system and people's intrinsic sense of disgust. And so I'm going to show you some of the propaganda that did that, to know how this sort of thing works. Okay, so this is from Richard Konigsberg, who wrote a book called Hitler's Ideology, Embodied Metaphor, Fantasy, and History. So we've already sort of discussed the idea. This is sort of an archetypal idea grounded in biology, you know, that you're run in some sense on this underlying biological platform of deeply rooted hypothalamic systems and amygdalic systems and so forth, and that you're a collection of those underlying systems organized at some higher order level. Well, those underlying systems manifest themselves in fantasy. So, for example, if you're hungry, you're going to get a fantasy about going to get something to eat. And if you're lonely, you're going to get a fantasy about someone that you'd like to be with, and so forth. Because the fantasy is part of the manner in which these underlying biological motivation systems think. Okay, so what do you think? How do you think and talk if you're possessed by disgust? Okay. The state did, these are from Hitler's utterances. The state did not possess the power to master the disease. The menacing decay of the Reich was manifest. The masses feel that the mere fact of the Jews' existence is as bad as the plague. Politicians tinkering around on the German national body sought most the forms of our general disease, but blindly ignored the virus. At the time of the unification, the inner decay was already in full swing, and the general situation was deteriorating from year to year. The nation did not grow inwardly healthier, but obviously languished more and more. It's all disease metaphor. It's all disease metaphor. The symptoms of decay of the pre-war period can be reduced to racial causes. Anyone who wants to cure this era, which is inwardly sick and rotten, must first of all summon up the courage to make clear the causes of the disease. They think that they must demonstrate that they are ready for appeasement so as to stay the deadly cancerous ulcer to a moderate policy of moderation. The Jew must take care that the plague does not die. If this battle should not come, Germany would decay and at best would sink to ruin like a rotting corpse. You can see in the Reich today an example of mortal decay. That is not the speech of someone who's possessed by anxiety. That's the speech of someone who's possessed by disgust. They're not the same thing. The 1st of May can only be the liberation of the nation's spirit from the infection of internationalism, the restoration of health of people. Against the infection of materialism, against the Jewish pestilence, we must hold aloft a flaming ideal, another purification metaphor. The restoration to health of our people must start with the restoration to health of the body politic. So that was Hitler's essential metaphor. The nation was a body. It was a pure body. It was a pure Aryan body. And it was being assaulted by parasites that were subjecting it to disease and decay. That's the fundamental metaphor at the bottom of the political message. I gave the order to burn down to the raw flesh. Jesus, the ulcers of this poisoning of the wells. Yeah, pretty rough, man. This is the battle against a veritable world sickness which threatens to infect the peoples, a plague which devastates whole peoples, an international pestilence. The international carry of the bacillus must be fought. It is within this community. One state is infected, that infection is decisive for all. In Europe, no common life of the nations is possible when amongst their number there are some who are suffering from a poisonous infection and who openly profess their desire to infect others with the same disease. We shall have a very real interest in seeing to it that the Bolshevist plague does not spread over Europe. National socialism has made our people, and therefore the Reich, immune from a Bolshevik infection. I'll read you one more, although obviously you get the point. Table 7 is called "The National Body is Being Consumed." The Jew is and remains the typical parasite, a sponger who, like the noxious bacillus, keeps spreading as soon as a favorite medium invites him. All right, now I want to show you the film. And you can look here at the what would you call it, artistic and propagandistic transformation of the idea of order into a criticized message. And the thing that's so interesting about Hitler's particular brand of fascism, it wasn't precisely it wasn't precisely a movement that was predicated on ideas, like communism. Communism was predicated on ideas, but the Nazis went at it with something that wasn't really in the realm of idea. It was more in the realm of like embodying disgust and image, and so it was also very much more difficult to fight against from the ideational perspective. You know, it wasn't a well-developed intellectual movement. It was an embodied movement, and Hitler was extraordinarily good at using the metaphors and the images, and then his incredible capacity for propagandistic display to fire people up at a level of analysis that they weren't really even aware of. So let's take a look at this film.
The campaign in Poland gave us the opportunity to really get to know the Jewish people. Nearly 4 million Jews live here in Poland, but they won't be found among the rural population, nor have they suffered from the chaos of war as has the native Pole. They set it out indifferently in the gloomy streets of the Polish ghetto. Yet within an hour after the German occupation, they were back in business. We We Germans had a look at the Polish ghetto 25 years ago. This time our eyes are sharpened by our experience in the last few decades. Unlike in 1914, we no longer see just the most grotesque and comical of these questionable ghetto figures. This time we recognize that there's a plague here, a plague that threatens the health of the Aryan peoples. Richard Wagner once said, "The Jew is the demon behind the corruption of mankind." And these pictures prove it. Civilized. In plain language, Jewish dwellings are filthy and neglected. Not at all poor. After decades of business, they've hoarded enough to acquire decent, comfortable homes. But they lived for generations in the same dirty and bug-ridden dwellings. Troubled by their surroundings, they go right on to prayer. The baptism is part of the ritual for reading Jewish scriptures. Takes place in the street.
The connection with trade, you know, you see what's going on in the, okay, so with the juxtaposition of those two films, you see the juxtaposition of order versus chaos. And so part of the order versus chaos archetype obviously is rooted in the dichotomy between disgust and purity. It's not the only axis of opposition between order and chaos. And then, so this is all the invocation of archetypal chaos, and it starts with the use of the disease imagery, and then also the use of music composed in a minor key and threatening and low, right? So that's all juxtaposed together. And then they switch to trade again with this undertone of threat, and there's a hand-to-hand exchange of goods, and it seems to me that they're using the image to continue the metaphor that in this situation trade is associated with contamination rather than with productivity, right? And so you can see obviously a dichotomy with regards to trade, because when you're taking goods from someone else, the question is, are the goods of high quality and useful, and are they useful? Are they something that is going to introduce a foreign element or an unexpected element into your house? And so this film is obviously taking that ambivalence that's associated with trade and placing it in the chaos order archetype and then associating it with disgust. Very, very sweet. And it's not done, it's done by inference rather than directly, which I think is a much more powerful way of doing this sort of thing. Interesting too is that, you know, you can imagine that if you're seeing people who are poor that evoke two possible sets of responses. One might be a compassionate response, would be the desire to help, right, and the other would be the desire to distance yourself. Of course, you feel the same thing. For example, if you're walking down the floor and you find someone who's, you know, completely wrecked street person lying there in their sleeping bag in a doorway. It's like, well, what's your response going to be? Is it compassion, or is it fear, or is it disgust? Well, it's going to depend on your mood and all sorts of other things. It's going to depend on the particulars of the situation. It's going to depend on your temperament. You can see that those two things, they're both automatically evocable responses, and it isn't self-evident which one is going to come to the fore, nor is it always self-evident which one should come to the fore, because part of the reason that you're ambivalent about a situation like that is because you have no idea what would happen even if you did choose to do that. And so you can't just simply, what would you say? There's no simple way of solving the problem. And so that's why there's a war of competing emotions when you're in a situation like that. But you can imagine as well, you could have taken the same images, put them to different music and used a different overlay, and it could have been a call to compassion, but that's not what it is here. It's a call to contempt and extermination. Because that's also another danger that, I suppose, insisting upon the fact that the given population is victimized. I suppose that is because there's two different sets of categorical responses to people who are at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, and one of them is compassion, but the other one is more like this. It's not necessarily something that you want to carelessly evoke.
One might want to regard these haggling children as a sign of great poverty. But watch them a while, and it becomes clear that they're proud to act as their grown-ups do. These young people don't have the idealism that ours do. With them, the egoism of the individual is not in the service of higher common goals. Instead, Jewish morality, in crass contradiction of the Aryan concept of ethics, proclaims the unrestrained egoism of every Jew to be divine law. Makes cheating and usury a duty. In the fifth book of Moses, for example, it is stated that none Jew thou may loan upon usury, but not thy brother. That the Lord may bless thee in all thy dealings. For the Jews, then, doing business is something. This is totally incomprehensible to non-Jews. Aryan attaches a sense of worth to every activity. He wants to create something worthwhile: food, clothing, houses.
So there's a contrast there. They actually use a contrast there between industrious and non-industrious too, which is quite interesting.
Works of art or anything else provided to everyone. He's moved by the feeling of being responsible for his achievements. It makes no difference. The first trade goods are generally worthless trash of all sorts. That's how the little Jews start out. Soon they reach the point where they can sell to the trade. Before long they've assembled a complete line of goods. Not long after, the owner of the the most ambitious soon own a small shop and then a bigger shop. The most cunning, that is, the most unscrupulous, eventually have warehouses and banks and move into the most splendid mansions in the city, provided that they don't get in each other's way, as in the narrow gullies of the East.
Wie in den engen Ghettos des Ostens.
That's why they try to escape to rich lands with rich people.
Film, there's another something else globe, and then there's spread migration, and the underlying metaphor there is again spread
because they need the wares with which to do business. Creative Aryan peoples find the value has been reduced by the Jew to mere merchandise. Produces nothing. Production leads to the workers and farmers of the host nation.
Marxist ideology here too that's very interesting, because the insistence is that the labor that goes into basic production qualifies as labor, and the labor that goes into mercantile activity doesn't qualify as labor at all. It's not like the Nazis were capitalist by the stretch of the imagination. So there's this strange distinction drawn between, like it's almost like physical production, that seems to be something that's valued, musculature, say. But then he says it's elevated up as trade, which is obviously a value-added process. That's almost self-evident. But for here, it's something that's only parasitic. And that's a commonality with Marxism of the time.
Jews are a people without farmers or workers, a race of parasites.
Fuck yeah, finally.
Wherever the body of a nation shows a wound, they anchor themselves and feed on the decaying organism. They make business out of the sickness of the nations, and therefore endeavor to deepen and prolong all conditions of sickness. That's how it is in Poland and was in Germany. The Jews have been this way throughout their entire history. Their faces bear the age-old features of the perpetual sponger, the eternal Jew, who, in the course of time and worldwide wanderings, has always been the same. There's no difference between these Jews in Poland and those in Palestine, though the two are geographically separated. Palestine is the spiritual center of international Jewry, though the Jews are numerically insignificant there. Here at the Wailing Wall, they gather and mourn the fall of Jerusalem. Their homelessness, though, is a matter of choice, and in keeping with their entire history. 4,000 years ago, their Hebrew ancestors were already wandering. Out of the land of two rivers, they wandered along the sea to Egypt, where they ran a lucrative grain business for a while. When the country farmers and other Egyptians rose against the foreign usurers and speculators, they wandered once more, plundered their way to the Promised Land. They settled there, mercilessly looting the culturally superior rightful inhabitants. Here, in the course of centuries, from the Oriental Far Eastern racial mixture with Negroid admixture, the ultimate mongrelized Jews developed. Foreign from us Europeans, born of totally different racial elements, they differ from us in body and above all in soul. We probably would never have been bothered by them had they stayed in their Oriental home. But the cosmopolitan empire of Alexander the Great, reaching from the Near East across half the Mediterranean, and especially the boundless world empire of the Romans, brought about the evolution of the trade and migratory traits of the Jews, who soon spread across the open Mediterranean area, while some of them settled in the large urban traffic and trade centers of the Mediterranean. Others wandered relentlessly on across Spain, France, southern Germany, and England. Everywhere, they made themselves unwelcome. In Spain and France, the people rose openly against them in the 13th and 14th centuries, and they wandered on, mainly to Germany. There, they followed the path of the Aryan culture, creative Germans colonizing the East, till they finally found a gigantic new untapped reservoir in the Polish and Russian sections of Eastern Europe.
So, well, let's tie that together. We talked about the use of archetypes in stories. We talked about the relationship between archetypal symbolism and the biological underpinnings of the human psyche. And then you can see that manifesting itself in this sort of propaganda and the political positions that come out of it. You tap into the archetypal dimension. That's chaos versus order. You can place one against the other however you want from a propagandistic perspective, because you could make a film decrying excessive order. That's not a difficult thing to do, but that isn't what happens here. Order is associated with the sun and with what's good and with honest labor and with purity and with health, and chaos is associated with decay and disgust and impurity, and also with trade, which is extremely interesting. And the trade dynamic, you could see that in the second part of the film there. There was the implication that it was involvement in trade that was associated with this pathological spread, right? And so trade, that's another reflection of the ambivalence towards the transgression of borders. Is trade a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, that's always a political issue. It's a huge political issue right now, right? You're gonna